We've reached that point in our Forerunner Chronicles where we're seeing John's message ringing out and 4 different groups of people responding to that message. And we're taking some time to begin by looking at the response of the religious leaders who believed they had a right to salvation because they were part of the promised people of God, the descendants of Abraham. And they had created a religion that was based on works, their religious acts, and their identity as descendants of Abraham, of God's special people. And consequently, they believed that they were too good and didn't need to respond to this message of John to repent and receive salvation. And consequently, we see John's message that these religious people are clearly being rejected, and God's heart was that he could create again a new people from the stones if he wanted to. We were created from dust, and so the challenge to the religious people was not to get too big for their boots. And we've looked and seen that as the church, we've been given an incredible privilege of being engrafted branches into God's chosen people, into the promise of God as his inheritance, that he hasn't rejected his promises, but rather he's allowed the church to share in those promises. And that gives us a responsibility that we need to live out the call that was given to the people of God to represent God to a hurting world. We're called to be the image of God and not to put people off by the way that we live. And so how we've responded to the Messiah is the same challenge for us in the church as it was to these religious leaders who thought they were too good and didn't need to respond. John goes on from verse 8, from talking about God being able to create again a new people, to verse 9, where there's a second lesson that we see John giving these religious people, these religious leaders. And what he says is, the axe is poised at the roots of the tree to cut it off. And in Matthew's account, in chapter 3 of this same passage that we see where John's message is unpacked again, John says that every tree that doesn't bear good fruit will be cut down and thrown into the fire. So John has a really strong message for religious people that there's a responsibility about bearing good fruit. And we see in this the message that Jesus himself goes on to bring when he says, I am the vine, and he talks to his followers about staying connected to the vine. John's message and Jesus' message are very similar, but actually, unless we're connected to the Messiah, unless we are connected, we're engrafted into this tree, this fruit, unless we're part of the vine and bearing good fruit, then we'll be cut off. And there's an expectation here that if we're true followers of God, we will bear good fruit. Now, what is it about fruit that's so important? Well, fruit, first of all, is the seed of a tree. And that seed of the tree is a means of reproduction. A tree produces fruit in order to reproduce. The seeds are contained within the fruit. And so the picture of God's people bearing fruit is to bear seed. In other words, to reproduce themselves, that the tree can multiply. Another thing we see about this fruit is that the fruit of most plants tastes really good. It's attractive, and so the way that this reproduction comes is because people come and they take the fruit, they eat the fruit, and they go, this tastes really good. And consequently, the seeds pass through the body into the soil and are fertilized and produce fruit. And what we have in a tree bearing fruit is a picture of growth, that there's something attractive about the fruit, and that in taking the fruit and eating the fruit, that the tree reproduces. And there's a beautiful picture there, a challenge for the church, a challenge for the followers of God. And John's message is that we should be people who are the fruit that reproduces fruit. God's heart is to see growth. And if you go all the way back to Genesis 1, where God created humanity from the dust of the earth, he created humanity, put humanity in the garden and said, be fruitful and multiply. God's heart is that his followers will bear fruit and will multiply and create more. And to die without Christ is to die and face judgment. So the challenge of us, the challenge for us as followers of Jesus, is the same challenge that John's given to these religious leaders, which is about bearing fruit that is good to taste and multiplies the kingdom. What fruit are you bearing?